Hello there. Thank you for having me. Thanks so much, Mark. Yes, I am Helen Russell, author and journalist, and I'm delighted to join you this evening to talk about happiness secrets from around the world. I'm going to start with a bit of background about how the Atlas of Happiness came about, and then why this matters right now. And then I'm going to share a few of the happiness secrets and a few of the concepts I discovered around the world, and then summarize kind of some of the learnings that I had along the way from doing the work. So, as Mark pointed out, I started researching into happiness in 2013 when my husband was offered his dream job working for Lego in Denmark, and we relocated. And Denmark was then the happiest country in the world, according to the UN World Happiness Report. And I really started digging into why that was and wrote a book, The Year of Living Danishly, which was published in 20 countries worldwide, which was lovely. And I started to hear from readers all over the world sharing their own experiences and what made people happy in their countries. All great. Then something rather strange started to happen. I began to be ambushed in person in some of the most bizarre settings imaginable, from once at an airport baggage carousel, once waiting for a ladies' loo, sand dunes, forests, you name it, from people who wanted to share their own country's unique cultural concept around happiness. Now, I should point out that I live in a pretty small town that has an international community that's unusual in that it actually is a community. So people from all over the world have come to this tiny town in rural Uland to work for a couple of the global companies that work there. And whereas in many places, I lived in London for 12 years, people from all over lived in close proximity, but we didn't perhaps socialize, or you didn't really socialize outside of your social group. Where I live now, people do come together. And so I had the opportunity to talk and meet and learn from people from many, many different cultures. And I also have one of those faces that makes people tell me stuff. There's something, people think I look like a friend of theirs, often called Lucy or Heather. Anyway, so I began to be fairly used to having these strange conversations, and living in this high-trust society in Denmark had made me slightly more open to the idea of talking to strangers anyway. We have more to gain by engaging, than we ever have to lose. So I became quite comfortable having strange conversations whilst waiting to wee, and I listened. And some of the things that came out of these conversations were universals, like civic interaction, talking to people, having conversations, engaging. There were also things like exercising out of doors, and then also things like finding a balance in life. But some of the concepts were intriguingly unique. I found out more about people I'd known for 20 years by researching a little bit more into their cultures and into their customs. So I found out that my friend Marianne from Helsinki had been drinking at home alone in her pants for 20 years. This was normal. This was fine. This is what she was doing. But I began to write all these experiences down and research further, and I started to document the different concepts making people happier in different countries across the world, which was really interesting. And this isn't a collection of Wikipedia entries. I spoke to real people to try and investigate their cultures, and I spoke to waiters, I spoke to stay-at-home parents, architects, engineers, normal people doing normal jobs like you and me, to find out more about what life was like for them. And this is because learning about what matters to people on the other side of the world helps us all. It influences how we interact with one another moving forward. And learning how different nations view happiness has never been more crucial. As Mark was saying, these are fairly divided times, and we are all becoming more individual and nationalistic than ever before. So actually opening our horizons felt like a really worthwhile thing to be doing. So this is how I started writing the book. But here's why I feel like it specifically matters right now. If you've read the news today or been on social media for a fraction of a second, it's easy to get the idea that the world is becoming more depressing, that these are bleak times indeed. But this is because news is about stuff that happens, not news. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. So despite the fact that life expectancy has never been longer, leisure time has never been more bountiful than ever before, we don't hear about these things because they're not new. That's what news is. And in fact, I started looking into really what things were looking like on a global scale over the last few years, and I learned that Life expectancy has never been higher. World hunger has declined by 40% in the last 25 years. Child mortality has halved, and extreme poverty has gone down by 3/4. But these are statistics unlikely to be trending on Twitter anytime soon. Because when things are ticking along nicely, there's very little to report. And negativity bias means that as human beings, we remember the bad more clearly than we do the good. It makes more of an impact on us, and it sticks with us, which made sense historically. In prehistoric times, it was useful to remember to not eat the certain red berries from that bush, or to not poke around in that cave to rouse a saber-toothed tiger. This kept us alive historically. It preserved us. Our human survival has depended on avoiding risk and avoiding danger for as long as time has been going. But we were never built for 24-hour rolling news. We were never built for social media. We were never made or intended to experience danger from all angles all the time. So actually, we have to work to consciously remember the good, because if we only are aware of the bad things, if we only have this sort of negativity bias all the time, the natural response, if we feel like we're always in crisis, is to give up and stop trying altogether. But we can't let snark win. I came to learn from speaking to all these people that optimism isn't frivolous, it's necessary. If we want to make a difference, if we want to change things, we have to remain positive. So I didn't want this to be about burying your head in the sand. I wanted it to be about finding reasons to be cheerful and ways that we should be celebrating other cultures. So what I learned was that it was really important to understand that different cultures had different approaches to this. So some of the cultures have one way that can be the complete opposite to the neighboring country. But that's okay, we're all different. And some of the concepts contradict each other. But I hope that we could actually take what works for us and move on. So I set out. I had some fascinating conversations. Researching for this book involved a lot of laughter, some tears, great heaving, snot-filled sobs at one point. But I fell in love with each country as I wrote about it. I developed huge crushes on interviewees. I subjected my family to the cuisines of some cultures, and I am no great cook. They've not forgiven me for Russian month. But on the whole, it was pure, humbling, enlightening joy. I spoke to people from 30 different countries and wrote down the cultural concepts making them happier. So it's a horizontal perspective on happiness. I didn't just look at the countries coming top of the happiness polls, because if we only look at cultures we're already familiar with, we miss out on a wealth of expertise and knowledge from cultures we may be less familiar with. So I couldn't also rank them because they were all like my children by the end. So I went alphabetical. I went from Australia to Wales via Bhutan, Brazil, Russia, South Africa. And I wanted to take a horizontal perspective on happiness and what it means to live a good life around the world. So the result is the Atlas of Happiness. And I found that by the end of it, I'd really developed some insights into what I felt meant a good life for many people and how I wanted to live my life moving forward. So I'd love to share a few of those with you now, starting with the blindingly obvious idea that if we want to get happier, we need to prioritize it, especially over cash, like in Bhutan. So many of you will be familiar with this, but in Bhutan, they have something called gross national happiness, the philosophy whereby the collective happiness and well-being is measured and prioritized, crucially, ahead of financial gain. So we all have an idea of this, you've probably heard of it. What fewer people are perhaps aware of is how it works in practice and how it came about. So the practice has been used throughout Bhutanese history, but the term was coined in 1972 when King Wangchuck IV, here he is, very much the James Dean of the Himalayas. Don't look at him, Helen. He told a journalist from the Financial Times that gross national happiness was more important than gross national product. So this meant that he set out to implement a set of strategies that prioritize the spiritual, physical, environmental, and natural health of the country and the citizens ahead of financial gain, no matter what. So this is a process. They're not saying that they've got it nailed, they're just saying they're committed to working on it. So ever since then, they have surveyed the population. Every 2 years now, the Bhutanese take surveys, they talk about how they're feeling, and every decision that's made for the whole country is put through the prism of GNH. So their country only opened up to modernity probably from the 1960s onwards. Before then, there were no hospitals, no roads, no schools, but since then, they've evolved quite rapidly. So from going from no schools in 1960, they've doubled life expectancy by introducing hospitals and sufficient care. They've got 100% attendance in primary school from having no schools at all. And they've also opened up to television and the internet in the 1990s. What makes me laugh a lot is that from going from a position of being quite a traditional culture, they welcomed in the delights of WrestleMania in the 90s, became very popular. Because as one friend from Thimphu put it, everyone wanted to smell what The Rock was cooking. They also said yes to Kit Kats, very popular apparently, but they said no to McDonald's and all its cash because they were wary of the obesity levels that they saw rising in other countries. So King Wanchuk didn't want to isolate his kingdom from the outside world, like North Korea, hi. He wanted to find a way forward that balanced the old and the new. So now, not only do they have schools, they teach STEM subjects in schools. They teach the science, technology, engineering, and maths. Children learn how to build their own drones, build their own computers at school. But they even have their own MIT lab, which I think is fantastic. But teachers wear traditional clothes, and even in the new hospitals, you can opt to be treated with old Bhutanese medicine, which treats the whole body rather than the illness. So they're really finding a balance. They've also put sustainability at the heart of their culture. Now, there are clear links between sustainability and happiness. People who prioritize sustainability and care about the environment report higher levels of well-being in survey after survey. But it's something that the rest of the developing world, and let alone the developed world, has really shut their eyes to. Bhutan's the only country putting it at the heart of its policy. So they've pledged to remain carbon neutral, and they have also pledged to keep 60% of the whole of the country covered in forests forever, and it's currently 70%. So they're sort of nailing it. They're still trying, and in 2011, the rest of the world began to take a bit more notice as to what Bhutan was doing when Ban Ki-moon encouraged the spread of GNH ideas throughout the UN. So they started working with the Bhutanese government to see how they could spread these ideals. We're still working on it in the rest of the world. But there are things we can do. We can prioritize sustainability because it makes us happier, and, spoiler alert, it's the right thing to do. We can put happiness above our need for cash, which many people probably think they do, but actually if you analyze each choice you make, whether it's going to make you happier, whether it's going to make you money, you might find you make different decisions. So this was something that was a real eye-opener, one of the first things that I looked at. And the second area that I decided to investigate was the idea of work. Because if you want to be happy, you need to prioritize your happiness over money, but you also need to think about how you're spending the majority of your time. And for many of us, that will be at work. We spend more time at work than we do with family and friends combined. So in the UK, only 17% of us love our jobs. So I thought, well, there's got to be somewhere doing it better. And luckily there was, and it was a little closer to home. Because the Danes have this thing, arbeidsglød, from arbejde, the Danish for work, and glød, the word for happiness. It literally means happiness at work, a concept that doesn't exist outside of the Nordic countries, but is essential for happiness in Scandinavia, and especially Denmark. So Danes have the highest level of worker happiness in the world. It's the #1 country for contentment, and a study from the University of Aalborg found that 70% of Danes would carry on working even if they didn't get paid. They'd just rock up every day, which is lovely. They have a pretty short working week. It's 37 hours, but OECD figures show that the average Dane is only working 33 hours a week, which naturally at first I presumed made them massive slackers. But then I learnt workers are 12% more productive when they're in a positive state of mind, and Denmark has this happiest workforce in the world, which of course, if you think about it, makes sense, because worker motivation and happiness is essential for productivity, for retaining staff, and for just making it a pleasant working environment. So it kind of makes sense to do it that way, but not many people are. What helps in Denmark is that people can study for free, even get paid to do so over the age of 18. So more people get jobs in fields they actually like, which helps. But in Denmark, they also try to give some autonomy to the workers. So When you make it to the office in Denmark, when you're doing your meager 33 hours, it's a pretty pleasant place to be. There's a lack of hierarchy, there's a great love of consensus, it's quite informal. I mean, that's quite smart for a worker in Denmark. I haven't seen a tie in months. But there's no clock watching, so you are given autonomy over your work. As long as it gets done, there's little concern as to how, where, or crucially when you do it. But no one's going to say you have to be in there 8 a.m. sharp. But this is expected in Denmark. It's expected that you can do your own thing. So I live on a street of exclusively Danish people. My neighbor to the right, let's call him Lars to protect his modesty, he will go for a really long run every single day between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. and then reward himself with a post-run cigarette on his front porch. He can be found playing frisbee in the street every day in summer, picking a snowball fight whoever's passing in winter. And he has a big, shiny job, but he's just allowed to be flexible in that way. When we first moved in, I thought it was just Lars. Then I met the neighbours the other side, who have 3 children, really young children, a very beautifully manicured garden. Both of them have really, really big, shiny jobs that would be quite high pressure in any other country. And yet they go paddleboarding during the day. They went to couples yoga the other day on 12 o'clock on a Tuesday. And the husband has just taken up salsa dancing. So, it's not too shabby. Everybody just expects to be able to have a life as well as get on in life. And this balance between having a rewarding job and a life outside of work is what Arbejdsglæde is all about. So come 4 p.m., everyone will log off and go home, guilt-free. And this means that they are more inclined to feel great about their work. And as my friend Karina puts it, it's just like you can organize your work around your private life rather than the other way around, which seems fairly revolutionary. It seems like something that I certainly didn't do when I worked and lived in London. But in Denmark, it's the norm. So now I try to do the same. I try to log off guilt-free. And if we may not all be able to institute a Danish-style work-life balance in our own lives, but you can ask your manager that if they could possibly be more flexible. You can suggest that they'll get more out of you if they are flexible. If you're the boss, you can try to be more flexible and inject some glull into everyone's arbejde. So this was the idea that I thought, well, actually, we could all try and be a little happier at work. And if your job really isn't satisfying in some way, then there's something else that you can try, like the Greeks, and get a side hustle. So speaking to many Greeks near where I live, and then speaking to a few people in Athens, I learned a lot more about this Greek concept, Meraki. This is the idea of precision, devotion, and care applied to tasks, usually creative or artistic. So it's a real labor of love. And I found it really interesting. In the country, we normally associate it with, Zorba the Greek, with dancing or with drinking ouzo, with this big, exuberant party spirit. There's also this quieter, more contemplative pursuit of pleasure that's been keeping Greeks happy for millennia, and the rest of the world's just not quite in on it yet. So the idea with Meraki is that you're not dialing it in with a smartphone in one hand and maybe, painting something in the other. You are single-tasking and you're really prioritizing what you're working on. So, painting can be, it's usually an artistic thing, it can be a craft-related, or even laying the table with napkin swans and all. It's giving yourself completely to the task at hand, and even with a note of perfection, because perfectionism is only a negative if it's making you stressed, but if it's doing something just for you, then it's going to only be a positive. And this has been helping Greeks because it means that they have something else going on in their lives. Any of you who have a hobby you're really passionate about will know, if you feel like your 9 to 5 is a bit of a daily grind, having a hobby you really care about can make life better. So back to the Greeks. Anyone familiar with the tale of Sisyphus? I like to think of it as if your daily grind is like rolling a big boulder up a hill, only to watch it trundle back down day after day after day. Meraki and having a passion that you really take pride in can help days pass more quickly, even on days where it feels like the work is completely uninspiring, even some of the more grueling aspects of parenting. Having a task that you enjoy can make the day go more quickly, and it can give you a sense of purpose. Had Sisyphus been into macrame, just for instance, his daily grind might have not been so bad. Monday, boulder roll, half hitch. Tuesday, boulder roll, square knot. It would have been fine. It's like the ancient Greek Craig David song. But if he had prioritized it in this way, things would be easier, and we can all take inspiration from that. The Greeks have another ace card up their sleeves. So as well as their Meraki, most Greeks have a pretty good grounding in psychology and philosophy, and they learn about it from a really early age. So from the age of 8, Greeks learn about the Greek mythology, and from 11, they're onto the philosophers. So they have a really good understanding of psychology and what happiness means and what a life well lived means. And speaking to parents of Greek teenagers, they were just very casually telling me about how their children know that the goddess Athena helps those who help themselves. And another said, well, of course, my teenage son knows all about Plato's cave analogy. And I went, oh, well, I had to Google it very quickly. Of course, you all know Plato's cave analogy, right? Just in case you'd like a reminder, this is the idea that only by emerging from our cave into the scary outside world and embracing learning will we ever truly be happy. And really, this is a fascinating concept because this is what Greeks are doing in many ways. They have this really strong understanding of psychology, of philosophy, and on the days where even the intellectual understanding of the world around them isn't enough to keep them going, they have their side hustle, they have their Meraki to keep them happier. So that was a really interesting one to get my head around. The next thing I had to learn was to get a little bit better at rest, like the Italians. So, dolce far niente, or the sweetness of doing nothing, is a much treasured concept in Italy, as anyone who's ever visited may know. It often involves hammocks, is often on Instagram with a hashtag about hammocks. Because even if your life is feeling less Greek mythology, less Heraclitus, more hot mess, if you find a way to embrace rest in your everyday life, like many of the Italians I spoke to, this can help us gain a little perspective. And there's more to it than meets the eye. It's not literally doing nothing. I mean, it is literally doing nothing, but it's not just doing nothing. So I found lots of 19th century paintings entitled Dolce far niente. In this one, they're watching snails. It's as simple as watching the world go by, having coffee in a cornetto, the little cornetto, not the big ice cream with the Viennetta, no. But it's sort of just letting the chaos of life wash over you. And anyone who's spent time in Italy will know that there is plenty of the chaos to wash over you. So although Italy has faced a lot of problems in recent years and isn't one of the countries we associate with happiness, the idea of the carefree Italian still exists, and for good reason, because they do nothing like no other nation. There's this idea that Italy is quite rebellious. There's a distrust of authority, there's endless mockery of Berlusconi, there's, going back to the work of Dario Fo, there's been a real emphasis on satire and a distrust of the Pope. There's a fear of corruption, there's really high unemployment. Many people who have a job, there's no security, they might lose them at any minute. So speaking to a guy, Francesco in Rome, he explained it as being, it feels as though there is chaos all around us, so why shouldn't we opt out? Why shouldn't we take a moment to prioritize our pleasure, to be happy? So there's a sense of we may as well be rebels all of the time and just take these moments to enjoy our life. So as well as the Greeks, Italians are pretty proud of their heritage, from the philosophers to the Roman Empire, and although children learn about all of these growing up in school, in adulthood, as opposed to the Greeks who know everything by the time they get to adulthood, in adulthood, the one ancient edict that most Italians told me that they stick to is carpe diem. It's this idea that we don't know what's going to happen, so let's enjoy it now. So it's eat that ice cream, it's pull over in your Fiat 500 to take in the view, it's eat what you like, drink what you like, wear what you like. And this struck many chords for me because from my former life in women's magazines, I used to go to the fashion weeks in New York and Paris and London and Milan, and it was always Milan that was the highlight for me. Not because the clothes were most stylish, they weren't. Paris won that accolade, but because of the glorious riot of excess, the kind of throw everything at a mannequin and see what sticks approach, and this exuberance and this is what I want to wear today type approach to life of Valentino or Versace or here Dolce & Gabbana. It's this idea that why shouldn't we live now because we don't know what tomorrow holds. And while many of us may not be able to approach our life like that, at least not without getting fired, what we can take inspiration from is this idea of letting chaos be a little bit more part of our lives, and almost sort of sinking into it like a hot bath. Because many of us, certainly in the UK and certainly from my experience of living in London, we save up almost our fun quota for that big night out or for an annual escape or a holiday, or we try and blot out the noise of everyday life with alcohol or with whatever your desired substance or crutch may be. But what if, instead of blotting it out, we just sank into it, we just let the chaos wash over us and took pleasure from the individual moments instead, just stepping back every so often and just letting life go on around us? We might all be a little happier. And I think the Latin cultures are a lot better at doing that, and once you kind of get good at embracing chaos in that respect, then you're probably ready for the Brazilian approach, which was another fascinating country to learn about. My first book came out in Brazil, and I have not had the pleasure of going there, but I've spoken a lot to Brazilian readers and made a few Brazilian friends near where I live now, and they always seem to have such an interesting approach to life. And I've really pinpointed that saudade, this concept, is what makes Brazilians so different when it comes to the rest of us in terms of happiness. So saudade is this feeling of longing, melancholy, or a nostalgia for a happiness that once was, or even a happiness you merely hope for. Now, the word has been around since the 15th century. It first started out when Portuguese ships sailed off to Asia and Africa, and it was this expression of longing and missing for the people who were left behind in Portugal as these ships sailed out. But then in the 16th century, the Portuguese colonized Brazil in a really big way, and it became a feeling of loss for the country that people had left behind, the people who then settled in Brazil. And Portuguese did such a good job on Brazil that it's the only country in South America that speaks Portuguese. The Brazilians, they have such a strong feeling towards saudade that they have an official saudade day on the 30th of January each year. And in terms of sheer scale, Brazil wins. So although today there's a slight rivalry over whether Portugal or Brazil owns this term saudade, really, in terms of size, Brazil's hands down on that one. It's a really important feeling for Portuguese and Brazilian people. It plays into a lot of the culture. There are numerous artists who've been inspired by it, and musicians. There's a lot of pictures of people reading letters, looking wistfully out to sea, or swooning. A lot of good swooning they do. But really, in a modern-day context, it's really useful, and it's still very relevant. I spoke to a guy today from São Paulo, and he was telling me about how saudade means so much to him, and he was really pleased that it was kind of finally going past the borders, because this temporary sadness, counterintuitively, makes us happier, according to psychologists. Many of us will try to bury negative feelings or damp them down under a fog of busy or just keeping on going. But actually, by sinking into it is a really important way to kind of embrace it and to process it and work through it. And then you can kind of get on with your day. It also is linked to gratitude. So saudade is the moment you realize how important the people in your life are and how much you've perhaps taken them for granted. And back to the Greeks again, but the Stoic philosopher Seneca, he recommended that we all imagine losing everything we care about regularly to remember to be grateful for it, so that we learn not to take it for granted. But somehow in the rest of the world, we've forgotten this. We regularly take things for granted, and we don't stop to be sad about things. So for me, happiness is very much also linked to remembering to embrace all of the different aspects and all of our different emotions. There's also a really interesting aspect of saudade that plays into this idea of what might have been. It can also be a melancholy or a longing for what might have been. And we've all felt those moments of sort of twinges of melancholy or that bittersweet pleasure in flicking through old photographs or reading old love letters. And saudade is also a sort of a love letter to the life that might have been. And I like to think of it as a lot like Schrodinger's spouse. So if you could imagine, this is Schrodinger, this is the man. If you imagine Schrodinger's cat, we all know, right? Dead, alive, same time, don't know. So if you imagine, perhaps, if you'd ended up with your first love, if you imagine a life with them, someone just guffawed at the back, that makes me laugh a lot. But if you imagine a life with your first love, it might have worked out with them, but it might not. It might be that if you met each other now, there wouldn't be the same spark, or you might not be the same person anymore. They might not be the same person. There's an ambiguity to it. And just the same as with saudade. So the woman who is swooning, or the woman looking at that letter, her husband might have come back from sea, but he might have come back a changed man, or having met someone else, or just being a bit grumpy. So there's an ambiguity. There's a feeling that things might have turned out the way you expected, but they might not have. And it's okay to mourn and reminisce and feel a bit of loss for both of them, and then you can kind of get on with your day. So I found this really, really fascinating as an idea of, many of us spend our lives thinking, what if? What if I'd taken that job? What if I'd ended up with that guy or that girl? And actually, with saudade, you get to kind of have your emotional cake and eat it. You get to feel the sadness and the joy. So actually, we should all be crying and mourning and letting all those feelings out. And then maybe we'll feel like dancing, carnival style. So in this culture of very very exuberant, happy ideas, there's also this sort of sadder side. But as I say, Latin cultures are typically better at doing this more sort of extrovert approach to happiness. And if you are more Northern European in your temperament, then don't worry, because there are some other concepts as well. I found that actually many people I spoke to were still slightly reluctant. Maybe it's something to do with the climate. If you're not from a typically warm climate, it could be harder to embrace those. As I said, we're all different. So if you are more chilly climate in your approach, you can take heart from the Vikings. The original Vikings from Iceland have this great term, tataradost, or it will all work out. It's a national motto for a nation of modern-day Vikings who combine grit, this core of grit, with this easygoing persona, which is a really powerful but unusual combination. Anyone who's ever spent time in Iceland will know it's a pretty otherworldly landscape. It's so alien and bizarre that NASA sent Apollo astronauts there to train for the moon landing in the 60s. But, you know, there's geysers spouting steaming sulfur into the air. Then there's black rocks, and there's the milky blue lagoon. It's a bizarre climate, but people are tough. The original Vikings made their home there. The weather is so dreadful that they even have an ad hoc solar-free or sun holiday, even now, to celebrate the sun shining, or an Icelandic heat wave of 18 degrees plus. So even in summer, they'll get an ad hoc day off work if the sun is shining, because it's so rare. And yet, you know, the nation always ranks highly in the happiness polls. It's produced more artists, writers, general badass Viking types than most countries twice its size. Even the horses in Iceland are pretty hardcore. Icelandic ponies stay outside all year round, eating only what they can find, with no shelter, nothing. See, that's tough. So basically, as a nation, Icelanders were nailing it. And then came 2008, a nation that screwed many the world over, but none more so than Iceland, when their 3 major banks collapsed, resulting in the biggest banking crisis experienced by any country ever relative to its size. There was big unrest at the government, at the mishandling of the economy. There was a call for the politicians to... There we go. There was a call for politicians to step down, and at a time when the rest of the world expected that Iceland was going to go under, everyone remembers all the banks crashing in Iceland. Actually, that was when the Icelanders showed the rest of the world their tataradost. My friend Siggy and Berna from Reykjavik told me that they never felt powerless. Instead, they took action. They showed their tataradost. They went down to the home of the Icelandic parliament every Saturday and demanded change in what became the pots and pans revolution. They took all the kitchenware they could and just bashed it until the government just lost their mind. And they did resign. And they did get new elections. And by 2012, Iceland was one of Europe's recovery success stories. They had proven their tataradost, and actually the happiness levels of the country declined only slightly during the crisis, and afterwards 25% of Icelanders said they were much happier than before, because they had proven what they knew they were capable of. They had proven their tataradost. So this tataradost and this tough resilience seems to be rooted in the DNA, but it's also something kids are taught from a really young age. And as a mother of 3, I'm often trying to take inspiration from the Icelandic approach. They are made to walk long distances from a really early age, so a 4-year-old can do 5K, no problem. They are taught to go outside whatever the weather, because if you didn't go outside whatever the weather in Iceland, you'd never go outside at all. And whereas children in the rest of the world are currently looking forward to Santa making an appearance this Christmas, Icelandic kids get to have the nightmarish prospect of this likely lot. These are the Yule lads, 13 half-trolls, with names like Spoon Licker, Window Peeper, Sausage Swiper, and Door Slammer. And if you think that's creepy, that's the Christmas cat who eats children that don't get new clothes for Christmas. It's needless to say, Icelandic children are in touch with their dark side. And they also have really rich story heritage. They develop a really rich interior life. So when the outside world feels really inhospitable, which it does a lot of the time, the Icelanders are very good at hunkering down and coming up with stories like this to really stimulate them and keep them going. I think there's a statistic that 54% of Icelanders still believe in elves, and 90% are still open to the idea. So, books also have a really special place in Icelanders' hearts. So they're really good at developing their imagination and pursuing stories in this way, which has been shown to make you happier as well. So the country has more writers, more books read, more books published than any other country in the world. And 1 in 10 Icelanders will publish a book during their lifetime. My friend Siggy told me that there's a running joke in Reykjavik that one day they'll erect a statue to the one Icelander who never wrote a book. But, brain scans have shown that when we read a story, we mentally rehearse the activities, the sights and sounds of the story that we are reading. So this makes us more resilient. And also reading dark stories and experiencing scary tales can give us a boost of dopamine as our body gets ready to go into fight or flight mode as we experience what it would be like to go through what we're reading about. So all this reading is also helping Icelanders to stay happier as well. And so I decided to sort of pursue that a lot more. I read as much as I could, and I also was writing the book. So I thought, well, I was definitely going to get happier like an Icelander. But I started out looking at concepts in Asian culture, just at the point when I came back from maternity leave last year with twins, which was an interesting time. I was, despite all of my happiness research and despite all of these tools I knew I had to try to feel better on the days where things felt tough, I was still struggling a little bit. And then, with wonderful serendipity, I was asked to go to Tokyo for the launch of my first book there. And when I was there, I experienced this amazing Japanese term that really plays into happiness there. And despite Japan not being a terribly happy country, I thought, well, actually, there are some people nailing it there. So I really did a lot of digging with them and learned a lot more about the fabulous concept of wabi-sabi. And this is the beauty of age, a worldview centered on the acceptance of transience and imperfection. So it was a really hard concept to nail. I took months to talking to new Japanese friends and colleagues to really pin down what it was of all the untranslatable concepts in all the world. This was one of the trickiest. But my friend Yukiko from Hiroshima finally seemed to nail it when she said, it's like your grandmother. Or at least her grandmother, or Japanese grandmothers, because in Japan, with age comes wisdom. Getting old isn't a bad thing in Japanese culture. It means you have experience, it means you have intelligence and life wisdom to give. So, despite having one of the highest GDPs in the world, really long life expectancy, and a lot of self-help books actually published in Japan, weighing down shelves nationwide, Japan isn't a terribly happy country. It's thought that urban isolation and an increasing culture gap between old and young is making some people really pretty miserable. But there are many who now feel that by harnessing the wabi-sabi approach, things will improve. And so I wanted to really dig into what that meant. And actually, there's this idea in Japan now of getting out to nature as a real source of reconnecting with wabi-sabi, with reconnecting with these traditional ideas. Because wabi-sabi offers you a different perspective on the world. So it could be that you've had a terrible day at work, but you'll go into the forest and you'll see the moss growing on your favorite tree. And if you haven't got a favorite tree, now's the time to get one. But, you'll see the changing of nature. So sometimes crops will come out well, sometimes they won't, but you accept it either way with wabi-sabi. That's the Japanese approach. There's also a really strong emphasis on nature and getting out to spend time in forests in Japan with a forest bathing, this great concept that is nothing to do with water, a bit like sunbathing. You just spend time in the forest and it makes you feel better, which has been proven by science. We feel less stressed, where there's less of the stress hormone cortisol when we spend time in woodlands. We report greater feelings of relaxation and greater feelings of well-being. Anyone who's ever visited Japan may also have experienced onsens there. And then there's also the activity of gathering to appreciate cherry blossom. So this idea of observing the seasons, observing the change in nature is really powerful. And anyone who's ever gardened or so much as had a window box, you'll see it for yourself. You plant a seed in the earth and there is a silent underground revolution. Things happen. And being aware of that is quite humbling. It makes you realize that there's more going on in the wider world than just what's happening in your blinkered life right now. So really, wabi-sabi is about getting rid of all ideas of perfect. So although that was a pretty picture of woodland, it's not about pretty pictures or Instagram-ready, hashtag nature blessed type expressions of nature. It's just about being there. It's just about doing it just for you, after which you can return to your busy life or your stressful commute or your stressful family, relaxed and reinvigorated and ready to face whatever the day has in store for you. I started to think of it a lot like the English word patina now. But whereas in English, things aren't often valued for their patina, in Japan it's different. So we might say to an old leather armchair, upholster it. Or laughter lines, we might fill them. Or my stomach after 3 children. It's not that my skin's too big for me, it's patina, said no one ever. But in Japan, it's different. There is a celebration of things that come with age, from people to pensioners to pottery. And I also learned about the wonderful kintsugi. Anyone come across this? Love it, love it. Kintsugi is the idea of mending broken ceramics with metallic lacquer so that the crack, far from being concealed, is highlighted in pure gold. The crack becomes the beauty, it becomes the feature. And this is a wonderful way of looking at the world. So we all have scars or cracks of some way, of some kind or another. But actually with kintsugi, that's part of the beauty. The break is in the beauty. So rather than covering up our imperfections, we should all learn to harness them. And it's a wonderful way of looking at the world, that I am not a husk held together by dry shampoo and willpower. I am a kintsugi creation of the highest order. We are all wabi-sabi masterpieces of our own making. Because we all go through tough times. We all experience tough times in our lives, or feel out of sorts, or have scars of one kind or another. And I think by looking at Japan and looking at a culture that we don't associate with happiness, it's really interesting to see how people in those countries are still finding happiness. Because according to the polls and the surveys nationwide, it's the big things that contribute to happiness. So like health, security, economic stability, lack of corruption. These are big government mandated things that we are sometimes not going to be in control of. So it's really helpful to look at cultures that don't have those things. None of us know what's going to happen in our future. Things change. We have to be flexible. We have to find ways to look after ourselves and to be happy, even when we're facing really adverse circumstances. Like in the final example I would like to share with you this evening, from Syria. Now, when we think of Syria, we don't think about happiness. The country has endured numerous occupations and invasions over the years. And then in 2012, a peaceful uprising against the president escalated rapidly into full-scale civil war. Half of Syria's 21 million strong population has been displaced, and the devastation continues with daily news reports about what's happening there and the best ways to help, or increasingly not help, refugees. And we can all feel guilty about that, but we can also still try to find ways to make things better. And as I said, I now live in this strange international community, but it's also given me a lot of opportunities to meet people from different backgrounds. And there are a couple of asylum centers near where I live. So over the last few years, I've learnt a bit more about Syrian culture. And speaking to people mainly from Damascus and Aleppo near me, there's this sense that for many who have now reached a safe place, it is impossible to sustain an apposite level of anguish for what they've been through. You cannot go through every day with the knowledge of what's happened. You have to find a way to get on with your day. And for the people who still have their lives, one guy, Madian, said it's as though he feels a responsibility to really live his life now because he has his, where many around have lost theirs. And there are still things that bring pleasure, like spending time with family, like good food, and like the final example I'd like to share tonight, which is tarab, this musically induced ecstasy, this term used to describe the heightened emotional effect of certain types of music. So with tarab music, it's this idea that it's listening really intently. It's not something you can get with a 3-minute pop song. It's typically music that you listen to with going on a journey almost. So they deal with really big topics, tarab-inspired music. It deals with love or death or religion usually, and things get quite deep quite quickly. But as one guy from Aleppo told me, music like this just has the incredible power to move you, change the way you think about things, and yes, make you happier too. So I was given a crash course in tarab-inducing music by my Syrian guides, and the first person I was instructed to listen to at great length was this one, Farid al-Atrash. He was known as the king of the oud, this lute-like stringed instrument, and it's hugely popular. So songs could last for up to 90 minutes, depending on the mood on the night or the audience reaction. It was very interactive. And Kulthum, another one I learnt about, and I listened to at great length, actually. I really recommend. She was known as the Star of the Orient, or even Egypt's fourth pyramid. She's basically the most famous person you've never heard of. She's fabulous. She was lauded by, everyone from Maria Callas to Bono. Don't let that put you off. But she would repeat the same line over and over again until she brought her audiences to the brink of ecstasy or tarab. And she just became this massive institution. And what's a lot of Syrians find really helpful now is that this music is still preserved in perpetuity online. So although it's not quite like being able to experience the music in their home country, of course, there is a sense that they can connect with their culture via online sources. And actually there's UNESCO projects now to try and preserve Syrian musical heritage, teaching people how to play the oud and teaching them the melodic developments of tarab music. Now, of course, with our Western-centric approach to these scientific research of this kind, there is no research into what effect tarab music has on you. So I had to make do with the next best thing, the Western equivalent of that, which is probably opera. So this is often described as an out-of-body experience, but the basis of most opera is love and death, a lot like in tarab music. And opera has been shown to alter your mood. It's been shown to have very strange effect on brain activity and neural pathways. And my favorite study on this was a 2012 study where they played La Traviata to mice who were recovering from heart surgery. And the mice who were played Verdi lived 4 times longer than the mice who were denied their fill of Verdi. So tarab music is essentially life support. But what we also know is that opera has a similar scale, I guess, to tarab, in that it takes you on a journey. It's longer than your average listening fare, and it has really complicated progressions and complicated chords involved. So there's also nothing like listening to it live, though. Just as with opera, tarab live is one of the things that many Syrians now miss. And it's an amazing feeling, of course, when an audience gets really involved. Madian told me that with live music, it's like you aren't alone anymore, at least for a little while. And researchers from Imperial College London have found that when we listen to music live, we feel less stressed. There's a reduction in cortisol, the stress hormone. And a study from Goldsmiths found that those who attended a live concert found their mood boosted by 20%. So for Syrians, they used to listen to a lot of tarab music live, and suddenly they took it for granted, and then suddenly it was gone, and they almost felt like a part of them was gone as well, many people were telling me. And just as many of us probably take the opportunity to listen live now, imagine it was gone. You might feel like a part of you was gone also. So for me, when I had kind of been totally humbled by this experience of learning more about this culture. It felt like there was quite a profound experience when you are in front of another person, listening to them, sharing a moment together. It's an experience like no other, especially when you're among people who are strangers before you are connecting in that way. But then you have shared something together. There's an amazing bonding activity in that. So by the end of my research, my main overriding feeling and learning was that we all have to connect more. And the way we experience the world around us has really changed over the last 20 years. It used to be that we would go to places and meet people and interact. But now, in the era of the selfie, often we will go to other places. We will either experience the world through rolling news or through social media, but even if we make an effort to go there, we are often just taking pictures of ourselves. Same us, same pose, same face, same look, maybe just a different backdrop. We are traveling more, but we are experiencing less. We are seeing rather than experiencing. We need to sort of connect more. We need to find ways almost back to each other. In these digital times, we need more analog conversations. And by the end of my research, the world seemed like a bigger and a smaller place at the same time. Smaller because no matter where I was or who I was speaking to, people were just people wherever they were. Everyone I spoke to, we all want what's best for our children. We all love, we all feel, we all eat, we all sleep. These are universals. What's different is sometimes our approach to these things, but these are things that we can learn from. They are not things to be feared. People everywhere I went, everyone I spoke to were, on the whole, really nice. It also seemed like a bigger place than ever before because there was so much I had yet to learn and so many cultures I had yet to discover. But this was humbling and this was a good thing and a really healthy dose of perspective in our busy modern lives. So if I could leave you just one message from this evening, it would be this: we have to engage more. We can all rest, recoup, restore our compassion levels, but then we have to get out there to make a difference. We can get happier to look after ourselves so that we are more useful to go out there and try and make other people happy too, which is, I think, what Mark said at the beginning is kind of what the point of all of this is. So I would just like to, finish by saying that optimism isn't frivolous, it's necessary. We all need to engage. Thank you.
Helen, thank you so much. Please don't go anywhere, folks, because we're only partway through the evening because we're going to have a chance to explore and engage in these ideas in a bit more detail. That was wonderful, really inspiring tour around the world and lots to think about. I'd like to just ask a couple of quick things and then very much open this out to the floor. We've got some microphones, very keen to hear your responses. I'm sure you've got questions for Helen on this global tour. One of the things I loved about what you did with your Living Danishly work, Helen, when you kind of obviously went and lived in a different culture and kind of not only observed why is it the Danes might be happier, but then started, I think, talking about how you had made some changes in your own life as a result of that. I wondered, to put you on the spot slightly, you've now looked at a whole range of different things from around the world. Can you give maybe one or two examples of things from this, or indeed from the book more broadly, that have actually led to sort of changes you've ended up making, and perhaps even if they've surprised you, that the effect it's had on your life?
Oh, good question. I think the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi came at a time when, if you go through any major life change, you question your identity a little bit, and you're not quite sure. I wasn't quite sure who I was anymore. When I was pregnant with twins, I was on bed rest. I was in a wheelchair for a lot of the time. It was a transformative experience, as you would expect. And then coming back to trying to be a working person after that was a very strange thing to get my head around. So this idea of the transience and the beauty and imperfection and just a more natural approach to life was really helpful. And then I think the saudade, this idea that it's okay not to be okay, that some degree of suffering in life is inevitable and we should not run from it, but almost run towards it and just, process it and then move on, was really helpful.
I think that's really important. And I think one of the challenges to people, those of us that care deeply about happiness and promoting happiness, is at no point are we saying that a happy and meaningful life is about it's all fine here and ignore the negative emotions. I think in both those examples, you've shown that it's the richness of dealing with whatever life throws at us that really matters. I'd also just like to acknowledge the fact that I've been trying to think about writing a book for years now. You've just churned out one, and you've had twins within a year. That's absolutely remarkable. Not quite sure how.
Viking DNA. It's clearly seeping in there somewhere. Yeah.
And the other thing I was sort of struck by was the balance between what we can do as individuals in response to these things and to how much this depends on the culture we're in. Obviously, these cultures you've talked about have huge historical differences and so on. So taking that wabi-sabi, if I've got that right example, well, actually, let's think about this with the audience, actually. So I'm guessing what may happen here, but I may get this wrong, but for how many of you that idea of being able to embrace imperfection and kind of recognize that life is imperfect and transient and all the rest of it is kind of something you kind of feel that you have in your own life, that you kind of a willingness to sort of accept that there's an imperfection aspect. So a reasonable portion of us, I reckon if I was to say how many of you feel as though British culture in general allows us to be imperfect and kind of embrace that, is that less hands or more hands? Yeah, it looks like slightly less hands. I mean, it's a slightly forced example, but I guess to some extent, what we're able to do is about our personal choices, and you've highlighted that we can engage more and so on. But we're also shaped a bit by the culture we're in. Do you think it's easy for us to adopt these things in the context of Britain, which you also know pretty well, or are there sort of challenges to that, do you think?
I think with all of these things, we've become much more aware in recent years of I guess with one of the upsides to the world becoming more global is that we are becoming aware of different cultures and what different cultures do differently. So I was having a conversation with someone today about, for instance, mental health. Even 5 years ago, it was a taboo to admit to mental health problems because they were for fear that it would damage your career if you were with a mainstream employer, for example. And now we are a lot better at that. So I think by having these conversations, by being more open, I feel like failure is a really big one that people are talking about now, that it's sort of, we learn from our failures, and all big business people, even if money is the only metric you value, big business people fail, and that's how they learn to be better at it. So I think we have to start the dialogue. Like Hygge was when I first came here and talked to you about Hygge, that was not something people practiced in the UK. Now it's pretty mainstream.
Let's just test it out. So how many here feel quite familiar with this idea of Hygge now? Look at that. So you've obviously got your fan base here, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah. So I think that's how you have to start the conversations. Yeah.
Does anyone who didn't put their hand up then, do you want to just quickly remind us what that does mean?
Hygge, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Any Danes? Hygge is this idea of cozy togetherness. It's a lot to do with being kind to yourself, and studies have shown that it makes you feel better because you're being kind to yourself, practicing self-kindness. It also makes you nicer to the people around you, because just as if you're hungry, you have that sort of hanger towards other people. If you're being nice to yourself, you're nice to other people. And it's been shown to have a ripple effect out into society in Denmark because people pay that kindness forward. So this idea of togetherness, it's prioritized in every area of Danish life. So it's a big thing there, and it's slightly being commoditized when it's commodified when it comes over here. It shouldn't be for sale, but it is here now. So.
Thank you. So I'd like to open up to the floor. We've got lots of time for questions. So maybe, especially if you've been in any of these cultures yourself, if you had any observations or reflections, but if you'd like to ask Helen any questions, I've got plenty more things I'd love to ask her, but I don't want to dominate the show. So we've got microphones. If you'd like to put your hand up, let's try and keep these fairly succinct if we can. Fiona, there's a lady here, first of all, start us off. Thank you.
Hi, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in finding happiness through work because we spend so much of our lives doing it, and there's a conversation in the UK particularly that work is something we just have to do in order to live, and we can't wait for the weekend.
Yeah.
And I just think it would be so much better if we could embrace work and look at what's good about it.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in the Danish concept here. So obviously they don't work as much, but do they do different types of work? Because there's this idea of strengths-based work, isn't there? If you work to your strengths, you're happier.
Yeah.
Is that something that's embraced there or not?
I think more people, because you can study for free, more people can get jobs they like in fields they're interested in. And because you pay such high taxes, there's not much incentive to get a job that you don't like because it pays more, because you're going to give away that money anyway. So more people go for jobs they like, but still things need to be done. You still need someone to empty the bins. Not every job is going to be a hoot all of the time, but for those people who I've spoken to, there is a sense that there is still meaning in their work, there's still a value, they are doing it to support their well-being or that of their family or their significant others. And also, there's a camaraderie in it, there are strong unions. I guess for things that we can replicate outside of Denmark, I think having workmates is a really big one and is a really key one. And just finding moments of gratitude of finding like, we're going to stop at 11, we're going to have some cake. Or, you know, I don't mean to bring everything back to cake, but I essentially will bring everything back to cake. This idea that you're identifying pleasure and you're making a point of scheduling it almost. Scheduled fun, I'm afraid. Yeah, but workmates have been proven to make the day go faster and make things a lot better, so that's something we can all try and cultivate.
Can we just, on that question, so how many here would say that they are really happy in the work that you do on a daily basis?
Wow,
so
it's the whole 17% of the UK in one room.
Is that what the stat is?
Yes,
is
17%
yeah, so that's
Brits
definitely a
like their
happier than
job.
average room, but even in a group of people who are passionate about doing things they care about and contributing to that kind of culture, there's still a significant proportion of us who don't have that experience, and I think that does reflect on partly the work environments we create, but also your point about the narrative we have about, like, work's kind of almost the means to an end rather than enjoyable in
But
itself.
interestingly, sorry, we can move on,
please.
but as I said, some cultures have differing approaches, and in Germany, they don't expect pleasure from work. That's not important. They expect to work really hard, then stop work, then have fun. And then they have Gemütlichkeit, which is a little like Hygge, but it's more private, and it's more that you have to have earned it. So there's a there's a different approach. So yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to share it. You pick what works for you.
Were there any countries when you were putting the book together where you thought, I'd really like to find a happiness tip from this place, but I can't?
Yeah, have we got any Polish people in?
Goodness.
I have the most lovely Polish readers. They are so supportive, they are wonderful, they're really communicative, really demonstrative, but everybody I spoke to said, no, I'm afraid there's nothing from this country.
Really? Okay, well, we should be on a mission collectively to spread happiness to the Poles. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Let's move over to this side of the room and take this lady here. Thanks.
Hi there. You mentioned drinking in your pants earlier.
Yes.
Do you want to expand on that?
I would love to, yes. So, in Finland, kalsarikanit, my pronunciation guide here, kalsarikanit is this practice of drinking in only your underpants with no intention of going out, which I love. It's so specific, and it's so... anyone who hangs out with Finns, they're really practical, really matter-of-fact, and they're like, well, I am drinking, I'm not... And my Finnish friends could not believe that I'd never done that. They sort of said, well, of course, it's something everyone's done at some point, right? It's like, what? No, because in England, houses are quite drafty. I mean, and the idea, like, why wouldn't you do it in maybe your pajamas or maybe a slanket? And they said, no, just your pants. And the idea is like nothing lacy, no thongs, and you need to shut your curtains so that nobody can see you. But it's just this idea of, especially once you kind of pass the age 30 mark, that some days you just have had maybe you've had a hard day, and maybe you've done your Germanic, you've worked hard, now you're going to play hard, but you don't feel like going out. And Finns can be quite solitary. So there's this idea, well, actually, I would like a beer, but I don't want to go out, so I'm going to jolly well sit here. And it gives them a huge amount of pleasure. And it's a really, it doesn't sort of discriminate. It's open to everyone. It's really accessible, so there's a real sort of equality to it. Just everybody is... It's not...
I just love the logic of, I've worked hard, I got home, I fancy a bit, I might get undressed for this one.
It's like not naked and not wearing something comfortable, literally. Yeah.
Brilliant. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. There's another question nearby, Linda, I think. Yeah, thank you. This gentleman here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your time and for your talk. It's been wonderful. What you were talking about with Iceland was really interesting. I just got back to a trip from there, and one thing that I noticed was I didn't actually see it, but I heard about it. The mothers often leave their babies in strollers outside of coffee shops.
Oh yeah, I do that. Yeah, it's fine.
Outside of coffee shops, and they go inside and grab their coffee because there's so much trust in society. And I guess my question is, observing all these differences in cultures, and probably differences in the trust people have in others, do you any observations there on what leads to trust of strangers and how that is related to happiness?
What a great question and very, very topical, I think.
Yes,
So,
that's a really good question. Yeah, that is the same throughout the Scandinavian countries. So in Denmark, it's the same. I leave my kids outside to sleep in strollers. In Denmark, 79% of Danes trust most people. It's just an extraordinary statistic. But there's a real debate, actually, that's really interesting about whether the high levels of trust are because of the welfare state model, or the welfare state model is because of the high levels of trust. Because there's a trust that you'll pay your taxes, your neighbour will pay theirs, the government will spend the money wisely. And there are two schools of thought, and some people think that there's just something in the DNA that makes people high trust. But actually, my belief is that if you look at statistics about people moving from low trust societies to high trust societies, especially refugees, for example, in a few years they will adopt the high trust society behavior and they will start being more trusting. So I think there is something about having an idea where you share more. If you share, then you don't have to worry your neighbour's going to rob you to put food on the table. If everybody is looked after, then there is more trust, and then you have the headspace to be happy more. So, yeah, there are some really interesting studies around that, and a lot of the countries that come top of the world happiness polls tend to be high trust societies. But you can still find, of course, happy individuals and unique happiness concepts in countries that don't come top of those polls, in countries that don't have so much trust.
I really love this question. And I mean, it's worth noting that in the UK, the levels of trust back in the 70s were not too dissimilar to where some of Scandinavia is now. One of the really sad things, if you look at the trust data in the UK, is it's actually really crumbled over the last sort of 30, 40 years.
We were taught not to trust.
And exactly. And I remember, I don't know if many of you in the room, but I mean, certainly when I was about the age of my eldest daughter is now, sort of 12, there was a very strong narrative around stranger danger came in for the first time of basically the narrative is, if you don't know somebody, don't trust them, don't get in a car, don't accept sweets and so on. Obviously driven by really real concerns about child welfare and the occasional awful thing that could happen. I mean, I had my daughter come home in tears recently from a PSHE session, which is supposed to be about well-being and so on in school. She said, Daddy, it was basically about how you should never trust anyone, like online danger. And I was like, how sad that that's the message we're giving people. But it's driven by a real desire to protect those that are most vulnerable. I wonder to what extent the media climate plays a role here. So I think one of the things about the UK is we do have this heightened sense of danger. So, for example, the statistics are that you are much more likely to be struck by lightning twice than to have your child abducted or whatever. There's these things that we worry about as really real threats are incredibly unlikely. Yeah. But presumably you have a similar effect in Scandinavia. There's still a sense of the media creating a fear of the other, or is that less profound?
I think it's by no means sort of utopia, but from my experience speaking to people in other Scandinavian countries and living in Denmark, I think there's less of a kind of consumer and commercial drive for everything. So, for instance, kids' TV in Denmark, at 8 o'clock they stop broadcasting kids' TV. There's no adverts or anything like that. They just show all of the kids' TV characters just going to sleep because you're encouraging your own kids to do that. So rather than trying to make more money out of beleaguered parents at that time of day, they recognise what's best for everyone actually is everyone just gets the heck to sleep. So, and I guess there's less of a push all the time, whereas here, it's rolling news, isn't it? You're trying to create news. There's no news. Quick, go on about that bad thing that happened last week. There's less of an imperative to do that, I guess, in Scandinavian countries.
Thank you. Let's come to this gentleman here at the front. Can I just see show of hands of where the questions are? Okay, great. We'll come to the front row next here.
Hello. Sorry. I was wondering what correlations you drew between... my mind's just gone blank. Sorry.
Well, you hold that thought, and we'll come back to you in 1 second. There's a lady here with a question. Can we bring this one around here, Linda? Then we'll come back to you when it'll pop straight back into your mind as soon as this one's gone here.
Hi. Just wondering, with all of the different concepts that there are, if you think that you have to most benefit from what you've learned, do you try and apply those to your personality? So try and apply some of those concepts that most suit you, or the practicalities of your life, or should you try and kind of embrace all of them? So when you were talking, I was thinking, right, I'm going to go for a walk, find a tree in a forest, whilst listening to amazing music. I'm going to leave my kid at home in a stroller, and then I'm just going to come back and drink some wine in my knickers. Or shall you just go, right, that one thing is right for me, and that's going to help me, and then, or do you think it's kind of a combination of all of it? Or is it based on your logistics of what works?
I think it's logistics and your personality. So, for example, in Switzerland, so actually in Sweden, they have something called smultronställ, which is your symbolic strawberry patch. where people learned in kids' books. There was always this strawberry patch. It was very idyllic, and lots of flaxen-haired children were eating wild strawberries. And so as a grown-up, every Swede will have this idea of, I'll have my own symbolic strawberry patch where I'll go to rest. So it'll be like in a local park, or it'll be a favourite chair, and that's where they go to just get away from everyone, restore, and then go back out there. So I use that a lot. I have a walk-in wardrobe, get me. But I go in there and I hide behind the coats in my own personal Narnia, and I hide from my family. Unless they're watching, in which case I'm just hanging up some washing. So that's something that I use because it's personal, it fits in with my life. Logistically, it's just about possible. It's 40 seconds of peace, it's fine. But there are some concepts, like in Switzerland, for instance. Anyone who's ever spent time in Switzerland or with Swiss people, they're just perfect. They're just perfect. They always come top of the happiness polls. Even the Swiss aren't quite sure why. They are very meticulous, they're very hardworking, they're very wealthy, but they don't show off about it. They are good at timekeeping, good at chocolate. But trying to really pinpoint all of these things, why they were so happy. I stumbled on Roger Federer as a sort of an emblem of all that is great about Switzerland, but he's meticulous, he plans ahead, he works really hard, he settles only for the best, except for today. And he's just incredibly dedicated, but that's not something that works for me right now. I can't be a perfectionist. My life is too chaotic. I have good enough, it has to be good enough right now. So that doesn't work for me right now, so I can't go there. But yeah, it's kind of picking what works for you in your logistics.
The Swiss are also brilliant at local democracy. Their engagement at local government is incredibly... Yes. Everyone feels like they have a voice in the local community. I love your question because there's different schools of thought on the behaviour side of this. One says, go where your sort of energy lies, follow the actions that most appeal to you. But there's another thing about if we can expand our behavioural flexibility, if we can go, actually, that's a bit out of my comfort zone.
Yes, I guess that's true. Like, I try and run towards the dolce far niente because I'm not good at doing nothing at all, but I'm trying to be like, sit still. So, yeah.
I'm going to go home and immediately drink a beer in my pants.
Oh, good times.
Let's come back to this gentleman who'd forgotten his question. So,
it was more around the correlations you may have seen between a competitive capitalist culture versus essentially other cultures which don't prioritize it as much.
Yeah.
So in the UK, we're very much taught to be competitive from a very early age, and that works its way through our entire society. We're told to be at the very forefront of pretty much everything in it, and our industries show that. Yeah. And it has a benefit to a lot of degrees, but it's also very cutthroat. But if you go to countries like Brazil, if you go to places like Italy, family is the priority. And you end up realizing, if you switch the perspective, that the norm is actually that most people don't value that capitalism, that economic kind of servitude, or that perfectionism of craft, and they're trying to find the balance, which is what you found in probably Denmark and the Scandinavian countries as well. So I was trying to find out your perspective on the correlation of kind of that perfection of craft and that perfection and that kind of competitive edge, which we kind of obsess over in the UK, which is ultimately, in my view, pretty unhealthy, and a lot of people don't prescribe to. But because we are ahead of people, because we are competitive, people subscribe to what we think is right.
It's interesting. It's funny that there is an assumption that Scandinavia is just far too touchy-feely for all that, but Denmark is the fourth most productive country in the world. So they do all right with this approach. And I think in the UK, but there is a sort of a stigma to failure, and we're supposed to want to be competitive all the time. Same in Japan, but they're quite uncomfortable with failure, despite the wabi-sabi thing. There's a real dichotomy there. There's a mix. I think you look at different nations. Interestingly, in France, it's thought that, but despite everything that France has going for it, it doesn't do so as well as you might expect on happiness polls. And it's thought that it's the competitive edge that is encouraged from a really early age, even more so perhaps than in the UK, that is the reason for that. So in school, maybe if you're 6 or 7, you might be told, well, you're really good at maths, but you are not top of the class in geography, and you are ranked, and there is competition fostered from a quite early age, and it's thought that does impact on happiness. So.
I think this is a really interesting question, and the point about Denmark still being a productive economy is important, because I think competition obviously has value in the context of innovation and creativity, in it kind of bringing out the best in sort of innovation in work and so on. But actually, when it comes to human beings, I loved your message at the end, which is basically a sort of common humanity message of there's something universal about the desire to live a happy life and to contribute and so on. And actually, so much of the modern culture, as you were saying with your question, we're sort of set up in an us versus them, sort of I succeed at the expense of others. My whole aim in life is to get better grades, to get a better job, to earn more. And it's a sort of inherently competitive at a human level, which I think it is a difference in Scandinavia. There's more of a collaborative approach to wanting success collectively rather than success individually, and I think that's really important.
And actually, in a lot of cultures, so I spoke to Maori communities in New Zealand, and happiness and success is communal, it's collective there. And then looking at like the South African Ubuntu, the idea that I am because you are, and I cannot be happy if you are unhappy. So that's just completely flips it on its head, a whole different mindset that you think, well, for me to be happy, everybody in this room has to be happy. So guys, that's what we're all working towards, which is a lovely and amazing thing. But yeah, it's quite alien to many people growing up here.
Thank you for the question. That's great. Let's take one further back, because we've been a bit at the front here recently. So let's take a gentleman here and then the lady behind. Thanks so much. Sorry to make you run around with the microphone. Sorry. Thanks, Fiona. And if you could pass it 2 rows back once you've asked your question, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, great talk. You mentioned Wales was in your book, and I just wondered how happy the Welsh were.
Wales have... Are you Welsh?
Welsh background, yeah.
Okay, so with Wales, I went with the term hoel, which is the idea of, any of you who don't know it, it's from the Welsh word for a ship in full sail, when the wind is filling a sail and you're just operating at full welly going forward. And it's this idea of sort of male voice choirs or any sort of fire and brimstone preaching, but now it's completely secular, and it's this idea of living life at full pelt. So many Welsh people I spoke to said, we don't do flat. It's the highs and lows, and it's the drama, and even the voice. Typically, I spoke to an actor friend from Glenathan who was saying that he studied accents, and he studied sort of the origins of why we speak in different ways from different parts of the world. And in the flatlands, you can speak with really flat vowels because your voice is just carrying over flat landscape, whereas in the Wales, you're supposed to be carrying over the valleys, so it's got the ups and downs. So I love that. But I think, I guess, Wales has a really strong community, and they have endured hardships, and they've had their imperial neighbour who are much bigger and much stronger than them for a very long time. So I think in terms of Wales, it was very much the focus on the community and the real prioritising of education as well, which is quite interesting. Intellectualism is not a dirty word in Wales, as it sometimes is thought to be in the UK, in England, sorry. So, they really foster creativity, they really foster learning. Mining communities, for instance, would really invest a lot in education, because there was a sense that although people were really proud of the mining heritage, they didn't want that for their children. It was a really tough life. So education has always been seen as the route out of that. So through learning and through operating at full pelt and really just living life with your whole heart was the way to Welsh happiness.
Thank you, great question. Then if you could pass it back 2 rows behind.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So my question was around, you briefly touched upon technology and engaging at the end of your talk. How does technology and social media play a part in happiness? Because whilst it connects us, it's also really disconnected us and has increased loneliness and mental health issues. So, and then especially with the younger generation, things like Instagram, everything's filtered and everything looks great and happy. Yeah. How does that, how do you see that tie into happiness?
There's a couple of things there. I think you're absolutely right in terms of, we've seen studies that a guy who we both know, the Happiness Research Institute in Denmark has studied the effect of Facebook on our brains and on our moods, and they found that regular Facebook users who weren't doing anything special, if they had a 1 week off Facebook, they felt 55% less stressed after just a week. It's extraordinary. And so certainly, of course, it plays into a lot of negative aspects of mental health. On the other hand, it's so relatively new in our evolutionary life cycles that a lot of research is still going into it. And, on Instagram, for instance, now, because so many young people are influenced by it. And of course, how could you ever hope to look like the people on there? People are having to be more transparent now, saying this is an advert or this is paid content. We are hopefully moving in a direction where people are a bit more transparent, that things aren't shiny and perfect all the time. But yeah, it's not great. It's not something I welcome, and it's something that worries me a little about the future. But other than trying to foster and encourage a love of all of the analog things and a love of all of the offline things, like books and like getting outside, in Scandinavia, that's the priority. There's a sort of an acceptance that we can't stop the tide of technology, but we can just say, hey guys, walking's fun, or like climb that mountain, or go swimming, or read that book, and just try to just keep kids occupied with other things.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got time for just a couple more, so we'll come back down to the front to take this lady here, and then anyone who's desperately keen to ask a question or has had a hand up. Okay, great. So we'll take one more there, and then I've just got a couple of things I'd love to share with you before we end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm half Finnish, and I haven't yet done that, so that's on my
tonight,
bucket list.
hello.
Something for this evening. There we go.
Just talking about having twins and talking about kids. I'm kind of on a mission on how to get particularly adults to be more playful, creative, and lighthearted. So are there any particular countries that you thought really championed getting back to a 5-year-old mindset and being really playful?
Oh, great question. I think, or what do I think? From spending time in Denmark, there's a real emphasis on play there, even as adults, in a way that there isn't really even as children in the UK. Grown-ups are encouraged to play and given time to do it. And I think the work-life balance really plays into that. If you have Arbeitsglæde, then you are having rewarding play as well as rewarding work. But I think Australia has a really interesting approach. They have a real emphasis on sports, this fair go approach, so where everyone gets a fair chance in life, and sport is the ultimate expression of this. So there's this idea that it's not just a nice to have, it's not just an add-on, it's a central part of the culture. And sports is, in Australia, is not necessarily the same tribalism as we might experience here. It's thought that, you always support the underdog, because it could be you one day. So everyone gets a fair go, and everyone gets to be in sport, and you don't have to be the best at it. Just the worst thing you can do is be on the pitch with your arms folded. As long as you're trying, that's all that matters. So that feels like quite an encouraging model.
I love that quote. We don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing. Yes. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. We're pretty much at the end of our time. But what I'd love to do on the spirit of action for happiness, because there's been so many brilliant ideas this evening. And so in a moment, we'll show our appreciation to Helen, and we'll also do a little something I want to let you know about for upcoming events. But before we do either of those things, I'd just love to invite you just to reflect on all the things we've heard about, the different kind of cultural influences, from music to embracing sadness to imperfection to these wonderful ideas we've heard. What is it that struck a chord with you this evening? It might be about happiness at work. It might be about something you can take away. It might be about going home to drink a beer in your underpants, whatever it might be. I'd just love you to just take a moment just to reflect on something that you might do differently, because again, these things are all fascinating to hear about, and you might go away thinking, oh, that's interesting. But what's even more powerful is if we can go away thinking, I might do something on that. I might share that with someone. I might let someone know about the book. I might actually do this in my own life, try out these things. So maybe let's take a moment to just reflect on something you might do differently. We won't have time to discuss this now, but maybe as you walk out this evening, maybe you can make your final conversation with someone about the idea that's most struck you and how you might put that into practice, and perhaps take that away and share that with someone as you walk out. So hopefully something comes to mind that you might actually act on this evening. I'm very grateful to you for being here, Helen. So before I make a final announcement, please join me in showing a really warm appreciation for Helen on her work.
Thank you.